You walk through the forest and the air smells of the rot of wet foliage. Branches creak, trunks loom like foreign spears. The darkness under the canopy seems alive. But you are not alone. Beside you are 6,000 armed men, and all of them are strangers to this land. This is exactly how the first wintering of Romans in the depths of Germanic forests began. The question that has troubled historians for 2,000 years: how did the legionaries manage to survive surrounded by enemies, deprived of the empire's familiar comforts? The ancient historian Tacitus wrote that Germanic winters were harsh, and the land itself was damp, gloomy, and hostile to strangers. For Romans accustomed to the mild climate of Italy and Gallic plains, the encounter with this world became a trial not only by weapon, but also by cold. The warriors found themselves in a situation where the threat came not so much from the swords of the enemy as from hunger, dampness, and cold that pierced to the bone. These men in red cloaks, heavy armor, and rectangular shields were called legionaries. They were the foundation of Rome's military machine, that very force that conquered the Mediterranean Sea. But here, in the lands of the Germans, their tempered discipline faced for the first time an opponent that could not be defeated in open battle: winter. Archaeological finds in the Lippe region, where the Romans built fortified camps, show the first winterings were accompanied by colossal difficulties. Remains of fire pits and charred grain kernels indicate that legionaries had to dry bread and turn it into hardtack so it wouldn't rot from dampness. This simple but vitally important technique became the symbol of their survival. To designate wintering, Romans used the term hiberna. This was not just a camp, but a place where soldiers lived for months, cut off from home. Hiberna transformed into small towns behind palisades where people slept, ate, repaired weapons, and waited for spring. Imagine a fortress of wood and earth, surrounded by the darkness of hostile forests, where, beyond the wall, every rustle could mean an attack. The image of legionaries of those winters resembles players who were thrown onto the field without a coach and without spectators, and now they must survive, relying only on their own discipline. The legate, the legion commander, bore responsibility for thousands of lives, but no order could cancel the cold or find food in empty storerooms. It was precisely in such moments that the Roman army showed not the strength of swords, but the strength of organization. Historians debate who exactly among the commanders first decided to leave troops to winter in the depths of Germanic lands. Some sources attribute this to Drusus the Elder, stepfather of Tiberius, others to Tiberius himself, the future emperor. But it is known for certain, the end of the 1st century before our era and the beginning of the 1st century of our era became the time when Rome first faced the task of holding conquered lands in winter. And it was then that the question of supply, discipline, and moral fortitude of legionaries proved more important than military tactics. Hardtack, or as they called it bucellatum, twice-baked dry bread, the analog of modern hardtack, but they were not just food. This was a guarantee of life. Twice-baked bread, which could be stored for weeks, allowed a soldier to survive even if the enemy burned the fields and cut off supply routes. But which of us could live for months on such food, breathing smoke from wet fires and listening to the howl of a foreign forest beyond the wall? It is here that the main question of this entire story is born. Did the legionaries survive only thanks to discipline and hardtack, or was it a different force that modern people have lost? The answer to it is hidden in the very events of the first wintering, and by the end of this story, every viewer will understand that this question concerns not only the past, but also his own life. When a legion set off into the depths of barbarian land, the most terrible enemy for it was not the sword of a German, but an empty storehouse. The Roman army could fight only where its logistics worked. Modern researchers have calculated one legion, about 6,000 warriors, per day required nearly 3 tons of grain. Imagine, this is 25 carts loaded with sacks of wheat, and all of them must arrive on time. Any delay meant hunger. Ancient sources, including Polybius and Caesar, indicated that the foundation of a soldier's ration was bread. But in winter in Germanic lands the fields are empty, and the local population hostile. Therefore, even before the campaign the legate took care of provisions. Soldiers were issued grain, which they ground themselves, or ready-made hardtack, that very bucellatum. It weighed less than fresh bread and did not mold from dampness. Legionaries carried such rations on their own shoulders, and the rest was pulled by pack animals. To understand the scale, one must recall the word sarcina. This is what Romans called the army baggage train. This was a mobile city of carts, mules and slaves, where everything was stored, from grain reserves to field forges. If a legion is the heart of the army, then sarcina is its stomach and lungs. Without it, even the most disciplined soldiers quickly turned into weakened prisoners of circumstances. Archaeology confirms, in the areas of Germanic camps, they find bone remains of mules and fragments of wagons. These are traces of the fact that sarcina moved together with the troops, all the way to the winter quarters. Imagine a road through the forest along which a chain of carts crawls, the rumble of wheels, the snorting of animals, the shouts of drivers, and above all this, the roar of iron from thousands-strong columns of warriors. But even the best calculations did not save from surprises. Pack animals died from cold, roads turned into mud, bridges had to be built anew. In such a situation, centurions, commanders of centuries, became key figures. Their duty was not only to maintain order, but also to monitor that soldiers did not waste rations ahead of time. Discipline here meant more than bravery on the battlefield. The equipment of a legionary made him similar to an ant loaded twice beyond his strength. According to calculations by historian Goldsworthy, the total weight that a Roman dragged on a march reached 30 kilograms. This is armor, weapons, a food supply for several days, personal belongings. For this, they were called Marius's mules, a nickname that appeared after the reforms of Gaius Marius, when each soldier began to carry his own equipment himself. Imagine a football team where each player simultaneously pulls the weight of his wardrobe on himself, and at the same time must run a marathon. Preparation for winter also included construction. When a legion made camp, it transformed an empty field into a fortified town in just a few hours. First, they dug a ditch, then piled up a rampart, erected a wooden palisade. Inside, they laid out straight streets, tents, and storehouses. This ritual was repeated again and again, even if the soldiers knew they would stay here only one night. But in the case of wintering, the camp was rebuilt into hiberna. Dugouts, barns, weapons depots appeared. One important term for understanding this preparation: fortissima castra. This is what they called fortified camps designed for long defense. They were built not as temporary shelter, but as a fortress, capable of withstanding enemy assault for weeks, and it was precisely such camps that Romans erected before their first wintering in Germanic lands. The image of these preparations can be compared to a boxer's training before a fight. Every day he repeats the same movements, refines technique so that in the decisive moment, muscles work automatically. So to the Romans, the ritual of camp construction was their automatic reflex. Thanks to it, the legion could survive a sudden raid, frost or hunger longer than any barbarian detachment. But along with this, the preparation concealed danger as well. The farther Romans went into the depths of Germanic forests, the more their supply line lengthened. Every kilometer of road, this is one more chance for the enemy to set up an ambush, cut off the baggage train, and leave the army without bread. Historians note that it was precisely here, in this stretched-out nature of lines, that the future tragedy of Romans in these lands was born. Meanwhile, as soldiers sharpened shovels and dried hardtack, the land prepared for winter. Forests darkened, rivers covered with ice, and the air became sharp. Everything that Romans had done up to this moment was supposed to decide: would they meet spring in formation or remain under frozen earth? Autumn was leaving, and together with the last leaves, the confidence familiar to Romans was leaving. In Italy, this was the time of harvest festivals, wine and sacrifices to the gods. In Germanic forests, a time when rivers flooded with rains, roads got stuck in mud, and nights became longer than hope itself. It was then that legionaries first understood that their enemy does not stand opposite. It surrounds them from all sides. Ancient authors, including Tacitus, described Germanic nature as something wild and oppressive. Unlike the level fields of Gaul, here a soldier stepped not forward, but as if downward. into a quagmire, where each step pulled the boot into sticky muck. Mounted scouts could not move quickly, horses got stuck in mud, and even signal trumpets, tubi, sounded muffled, as if the forest swallowed sound. The term that best describes these first steps of winter, statio. This is what Romans called observation posts. These were small sentry groups that stood guard over the camp day and night. They were relieved every few hours because cold burned worse than a spear. Statio became the eyes and ears of the legion, and on their attentiveness depended whether a Germanic ambush would slip through to the camp. Imagine. Night, the fire is dying down, warriors huddle close to warm cloaks, and somewhere at the edge of the forest in the fog stands a soldier. His breath turns into vapor. Fingers don't obey, but he still holds the spear and looks into the darkness. For him, the enemy, this is not only a German with an axe, but also his own body, ready to surrender to the cold. Archaeology gives us rare but eloquent details. In places of presumed camps, they find layers of ash mixed with charcoal and animal bones. Scientists conclude soldiers burned even damp logs just to keep fires going. The smoke from them was acrid and thick. It ate at the eyes, but warmed at least the hands. In winter, smoke hung over the camp like a heavy hood, and the smell of burning, dampness and sweat must have eaten into the skin of legionaries forever. The column, which still in summer marched confidently and proudly, now stretched out. Baggage trains sank in mud, the wounded fell behind, and darkness concealed the movement of the enemy. Centurions walked along the ranks, shouting at soldiers, driving them with sticks, forcing them to keep formation. In such moments, the discipline of Romans was not simply a habit, this was a weapon. When steps creak in unison, fear seems less. The ration in the first weeks of wintering sharply decreased. If in summer a soldier could hope for meat or cheese, now his daily food often came down to hardtack, an onion and water. Sometimes they added wine, diluted with water, to warm up at least a little. And everyone understood, this hardtack, hard as stone, is your life. They crumbled it, soaked it, cooked porridge, but the taste always remained one, the taste of survival. The image of legionaries of those days can be compared to a team of climbers stuck at altitude. They don't move forward, but every day struggle to not fall down. The camp, enclosed by ramparts, turned into their cliff on which they clung to life. And all around, a cold sea of forest without end or edge. Historians diverge in opinions on how strong the resistance of local tribes was in this first winter. Some believe that Germans preferred to wait until the enemy weakened itself. Others claim that constant sorties and small attacks kept legionaries in tension. But one thing is obvious. Every day they woke with the thought that today the enemy might strike. For the commander, the legate, this was a special trial. He had to maintain confidence, give orders and show example. But in his heart, as in the hearts of soldiers, lived the thought, will there be enough strength to survive until spring? In such moments, decisions were not written in reports and did not reach historians. They remained in the breath of cold morning, when the legate rose first, put on his cloak and made rounds of the watch. The wintering began not with battle, but with slow, exhausting depletion. First people lost strength, then faith, and then comrades. Every day could be the last, and it was precisely then that discipline turned into the only shield against despair. Winter arrived. Not calendar winter, but real, the kind you feel in your bones, when the boot freezes to the ground and breath turns into icy needles. For Romans, this was the first acquaintance with Germanic cold, and it proved merciless. In Italy, winter, this is rain and light cold. Here, though, icy winds, wet snow, and darkness, lasting longer than the day. Ancient authors describe Germanic winters as a time when everything around became dead and motionless. But in this darkness, the enemy came alive. Germans did not attack in masses. They acted with small detachments that crept up to the camp and disappeared in the forest faster than the alarm signal sounded. Romans called such night alarms with the word concitatio, sudden raising to alarm. A soldier would jump up, grab shield and sword, but more often saw only darkness and heard shouts in the distance. Imagine that you fall asleep on hard ground, wrapped in a cloak, and suddenly a horn tears through the night. You jump up, hands tremble from cold, body heavy from fatigue. Beyond the wall, screams and noise, but you don't see the enemy. Each such alarm took away strength no less than battle. By spring, legionaries were worn out by constant expectation of attack, more than by the skirmishes themselves. Archaeological finds in the Lippe River region show that Romans in these winters hastily fortified camps. Charred beams, deep ditches and traces of earthworks say they lived in constant fear that the enemy might break through the walls. Trenches reached up to 3 meters deep, and in their mud stood sentries. The forest around the camp was cut down, turning it into a bare field, not from whim, but so that the enemy could not approach unnoticed. The ration became ever more meager. Soldiers cooked porridge from grain, onion and crumbs of hardtack. Sometimes even hides and straps went into food. They were soaked in boiling water to at least somehow satisfy the stomach. In the recollections of historians, there are mentions that such harsh winters broke even strong people. Those who only recently marched proudly and confidently now staggered around the camp bent under the weight of hunger. A special role in this time fell to camp prefects. The prefect, this was an official responsible for organization, distribution of food, storage of weapons, condition of fortifications. In the conditions of wintering, he turned into a person on whom the survival of hundreds depended. A mistake by the prefect could cost not one battle, but the entire winter. To somehow keep soldiers in form, commanders continued daily training, though shortened but mandatory. Soldiers practiced with wooden swords, heavier than real ones, through spears marched around the camp. This was not simply preparation, this was a way to not let people break. Romans knew, a tired body can still fight, a broken spirit, never. The image of that winter can be compared to a game of nerves. The enemy did not go into open confrontation, but every day tested the strength of the camp. Like an experienced boxer, Germans hit not at the face, but at the breathing, forcing legionaries to suffocate from constant tension. Historians debate whether there were large battles in these winters. Some claim that Germans preferred to wait and exhaust the enemy, others speak of many small skirmishes. But one thing is clear, not a single day passed without alarms, and each alarm brought closer the moment when soldiers might stop believing in spring. People died not only from swords, diseases mowed down their ranks, dampness and cold did their work. A soldier could fall asleep by the fire and not wake up, could catch cold and die in a few days. Roman medicine was developed by the standards of antiquity, but even the best healers could not stop a simple cold turning into pneumonia. Nevertheless, the legions stood. Hiberna turned into islands of civilization amid barbarian darkness. Fires burned, trumpets sounded, watches changed. In these conditions, Romans learned the most important art, the art of survival. And it was precisely this that determined who would see spring and who would remain in the frozen earth of Germanic forests. Spring does not come suddenly. In Germanic lands, it is felt as a slow turning point. Snow turns into viscous slush. Ice comes off rivers in jerks. Nights become shorter, but the air remains permeated with dampness. For Romans, this was not a triumph of nature, but a test. Did they survive until the moment when they could move again? Each winter left behind empty places in formation, and when the sun began to break through the grey sky, legionaries for the first time could count the real losses. Ancient sources such as Tacitus and Velleius Paterculus noted, wintering in Germanic lands invariably exhausted the army more than battles themselves. Diseases and hunger took away hundreds of lives. But it was precisely this trial that made those who survived doubly valuable to the command. A legionary who survived winter was a hardened warrior, knowing that victory comes not only from the sword, but also from patience. The term that symbolized the end of this agonizing period, exitus. In military lexicon, this meant the army's exit from camp in spring, the beginning of a new stage of campaign. Exitus was not simply movement. This was the moment when soldiers again felt themselves not prisoners of cold, but an advancing force. The column exited the camp, trumpets thundered, and the ground under their feet trembled from thousands of steps. Imagine the picture. The gates of Hiberna open, and from the gloom of timber and earth fortifications emerge the survivors. Their faces have become gaunt, beards have grown, steps have become heavier, but discipline has not disappeared. Shields gleam, spears are raised, trumpets sing old marches. This is not the same army that entered Germania in autumn. This is an army that passed through the meat grinder of winter. Archaeology complements the picture. In layers related to winter camps, they find animal bones with characteristic knife marks. Everything was eaten down to the last tendon. There they also encounter charred grains, remains of ceramic pots, and iron parts from carts. All this says that surviving warriors left camps, leaving behind only burned ruins and traces of struggle for life. For the legate, the moment of exodus was simultaneously a victory and a report before Rome. He could set the army in motion, but had to explain how many people were lost and what their combat readiness was. Historians note that a successful exit from wintering strengthened the career of a commander no less than a one battle, because he proved that he knew not only how to fight, but also how to preserve the army. However, not all winterings ended well. In the recollections of Tacitus, there are hints that individual garrisons could lose entire cohorts from diseases and attacks, and if precise figures about such tragedies were not preserved, it is only because Rome preferred to remember victories, not defeats. Nevertheless, the very fact that legions continued to winter in these lands again and again speaks to the resilience of their system. For a simple soldier, spring meant not rest, but a new campaign. But the very fact that he survived winter made him a hero in his own eyes. When the detachment exited the camp, inside each burned the feeling that he proved to himself and comrades, he is stronger than cold, hunger and fear. This transition from darkness to light can be compared to an athlete who survived after an exhausting marathon. He doesn't win a gold medal, but the very fact that he reached the end already turns him into a winner. So too the legionaries. They exited not with triumph, but with confidence that they became stronger than before. The historical consequences of these winterings were enormous. Rome became convinced that holding Germanic lands means every year sacrificing hundreds of lives not only in battles, but also in camps. And although the empire still continued to build outposts, it was precisely the experience of winterings that showed the limits of its expansion. At some point, it became clear. The Germanic forest can be passed through with battle, but cannot be completely conquered. Nevertheless, the very tradition of winterings became established in Rome's military system. Hiberna became a mandatory element of campaigns, and each new army sent to the north knew it would have to meet winter face to face. This experience Romans inherited forever, and it was precisely this that made the army one of the most resilient in history. Spring brought not only hope, but also understanding of the price of survival. Romans who survived their first Germanic winter exited camps as different people. Their faces were gaunt, hands cracked from cold, and gazes heavy from what they saw. The death of comrades not in battle, but from hunger and diseases. For ancient warriors accustomed to the glory of battles, this was a trial far more agonizing. To die not with sword in hands, but in silence, on the wet ground of camp. The historian Velleius Paterculus, who himself served in Germanic campaigns, wrote that the discipline and patience of legionaries made possible Rome's retention of conquered territories. But he also admitted, these lands would never become truly Roman. Cold and endless forests broke imperial confidence, just as a German's axe broke a shield. In this lay the main outcome of the first wintering. Rome understood that victory does not always equal control. The term by which Romans themselves designated such patience was constantia. This word meant steadfastness of spirit, the ability to maintain order even in the most difficult conditions. Constantia was considered one of the main military virtues, and it was precisely this that allowed legionaries to survive winter when there was not enough food, warmth, or peace. Imagine the image: legionaries sitting by the fire, chewing hardtack, warming hands over weak flame. Wind howls in the walls of the camp, snow crunches under the feet of the sentry, and yet they are silent, keep formation, wait for the next trumpet signal. In their silence, more strength than in a cry on the battlefield. This silence is Roman Constantia. Archaeology confirms that camps after winterings became real fortresses. Excavations show traces of fortified gates, watchtowers, and deep ditches. These were not temporary camps. Romans created strongpoints that left their mark in the earth for centuries. But together with these traces in the earth remained hundreds of nameless graves. Their names did not reach us, but it was precisely they who paid the price for Roman presence in Germania. Historians note that it was precisely the experience of winterings that became one of the reasons for Rome's caution subsequently. Yes, the empire still undertook campaigns in the north for decades, but never again attempted to completely subjugate Germania. The battle lost to Arminius in the Teutoburg forest only confirmed what winter had already proved. This land does not surrender the way Gaul or Britain surrendered. And yet, from this experience Rome drew a lesson that is relevant even today. An army, to be invincible, must know how to live just as it fights. It must know how to endure when there is no food, maintain order when everything around collapses, preserve faith when the enemy is invisible. Bread and sword, discipline and hardtack. This is what made Romans a force that the entire world feared. Romans proved that a human is capable of surviving where, it would seem, there is not a single chance. But this is not their ancient secret. This is a universal human strength. And now, each of us can ask ourselves, what remains in us from that iron will of Legionaries, and would we have the courage to survive until spring, in the heart of hostile land? Historians debate whether this was heroism or doom, but one thing is clear. It is precisely thanks to such winters that we know Rome not as a fragile state, but as an empire that withstood centuries. And in each piece of hardtack that survived that winter, there was the taste not only of bread, but of history itself.